and bring the power of your mind and the power of your understanding, the power of your knowledge as an offering to a suffering world.
Welcome back for part 2 of Dr. Robert Moore's lecture, Archetype, Compulsion, and Healing. But before we get back into the recording, I just wanted to show you how the audio has been digitally enhanced to improve the quality of the original cassette tape recordings for you.
This weekend we've been talking about compulsivity, which I'm encouraging you to become more aware about when you're doing reflection on your cases, whether it's the case is you.
The quality is still not perfect, but I think you'll agree it's much easier on the ear. Now let's get back to this second part of the 3-part lecture.
I'd like to turn now to this next section, in which we'll work with until 4 o'clock. And I want to do several things which we need before we move into our clinical and therapeutic discussions tomorrow. And what I want to do is to talk about contemporary psychologies of the self just briefly, and which I consider myself a self-psychologist. And I want to give some appreciation to Heinz Kohut and his followers, with the guidance of Dr. Margaret Shanahan, my wife. I have come to study and appreciate the School of Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology, which she is something of an expert in. And it's important, I think, for us to give some credit to Kohut and his followers, at least the persons that still seriously are trying to develop Kohut's own tradition. There are some people in so-called self-psychology circles, psychoanalytic self-psychology circles, that, in my view, and the view of others, are doing as much to lose the unique contribution of Kohut as some Jungians are to losing the unique contribution of Jung. But I just want to begin by saying, with the work of Heinz Kohut, in my personal opinion, we have made a revolutionary leap forward in asking the kinds of questions and doing the kind of reflection, clinical reflection, on the psychology of the self, both the little s human self and, I think personally, the capital S archetypal self. I think that there's been a huge move forward in clinical understanding through Kohut's work. I just want to briefly talk about a couple of aspects of his work, give you a reference if you're not familiar with. How many of you studied Kohut? So a number of you have. That's excellent. The work that I would recommend as an introduction and overview would be the work by Ronald Lee and others called Psychotherapy After Kohut. That's a nice overview and has good bibliography that you can use to get more familiar with that. For an important Kohutian contribution to these whole psychologies of addiction and compulsivity, I recommend the book by Lewin called Treatment of Alcoholism and Other Addictions, a Self-Psychological Approach. Kohut began, as Jung did, as a Freudian analyst, and soon realized that there were some themes presenting in his analyses that classical Freudian theory didn't help much in understanding them, his patients, and certainly didn't help much in treating them. And this was Kohut's discovery of what came to be called the narcissistic transferences. Freud had believed that there was one line of development, which we later called, in the personality, called the object relations line of development. And that personality development was from a self-involved, narcissistic place to a genitally related relation, appreciative and gentle relation to the object of relationships. And so Freud's understanding of narcissism was was sort of like what we studied today in Otto Kernberg. It's like, if you're narcissistic, you're bad. If you're self-involved and you're not related, and the challenge, according to that classical point of view in Freudian circles, was that you get past your developmental arrests and fixations, so that you can really love and work, so that you can get your assertiveness and your sexuality integrated. Certainly that you can get past your aggression, so that you can relate in a gentle and fully gently sexual way to others, to other persons. Kohut, in the early days, did not really deny that as a line of development. He thought that the object relations line of development was right. But he saw another line of development, and he called it the narcissist. There was the narcissistic line of development. Not only did you have to develop in your relationship with others, but you had to mature in your relationship to yourself. And so this is what we could call, for being simple, just being simple, a line of development for self-esteem and the capacity to really enjoy yourself, to really appreciate yourself. I was saying in one of my classes the other day that, think about yourself. Just how interested are you in yourself anyway? One of the things we will observe clinically is that many of our patients cannot sustain an interest in themselves, a focused interest. In fact, one of the hardest things about a person coming to therapy and really becoming an ally in the therapeutic process is that, and this is, John, in your territory here, it's shame over having anybody really take my material seriously. A shame reaction about being looked at, not in that hostile, contemptuous gaze that the French psychoanalysts talk about, but in a genuinely interested gaze. What we have to understand is that for a person to be able to come and sit in your office and to bring a dream or bring some vignette from their life is a bold thing. And we have to be more and more empathic with the struggle of people to be able to present themselves to us for seeing. And Kohut has helped us so much. We will be forever indebted to Kohut for understanding that a great deal of our woundedness is not on the object relations line itself. It's on the narcissistic line of development. That is, Kohut enabled us to see that narcissism is not a pathological thing in itself. That is, that narcissism is a sector in the development of the psyche, the capacity to not just love the other, but a capacity to love the self in a healthy way, without which, of course, healthy relatedness is not possible. If you are wounded in your relationship to yourself, as you all know, when true love comes your way, you have to rebuff it because you don't feel worthy of it. And there's this little scorekeeper in the psyche that just takes notes on whether or not you're worthy today to have somebody appreciate you, even your therapist. And most days, the little scorekeeper related to our shame will say, no, you don't really deserve this much attention to that. And if I'm your patient and you give me too much attention, more than my shame will allow me to take, then I will not be there the next session. My car wouldn't start or something like that. But I got more than my allotted amount of seeing on that last session. Yes. Exactly. Precisely. Exactly. One of the things that we're all trying to be more sensitive to as clinicians is the way in which we have to be extremely empathic about the disorganizing effects of therapeutic attention. The disorganizing effects of therapeutic attention. And so this is where Kohut was a genius. He had such capacity to understand the empathy required for a therapist, not to overload the client with affirmation or seeing or recognition, and all of those things that we assume that people can take in by the court without getting indigestion, But Kohut helped us to get a sense for the fragility of us and our patients on this front. So anyway, that second line, that narcissistic line of development, and he began to illuminate sectors in transference, countertransference relationships, which had heretofore been, partially recognized, left in a lot of darkness. For example, while classical Jungians have been very aware of projection and recollection, a la Maria Louise von Franz's wonderful book on that topic, Projection and Recollection in Jungian Psychology, Jungians have not been very sophisticated in classical circles about these narcissistic issues. They have not really given adequate attention to, until recently, to these narcissistic dimensions of transferences. What is really happening when someone presents themselves as arrogant and inflated? Jungians have been extremely quick to note inflation and attack it when they see it, and to sort of pathologize exhibitionistic presentations, and that's why they tend to overvalue and privilege introversion as much as they do. You know, Jungians get into a kind of a compulsive overvaluing of introversion in their particular location, their particular social and theoretical location, and so they've not had the kind of subtlety that Kohut brought to understanding what is going on when someone presents to you in a very powerfully recruiting way, being exhibitionistic to recruit your admiration. So when Kohut got into his wonderful descriptions of the so-called idealizing and mirroring transferences and countertransferences, this was a very important day in the history of development of psychoanalytic research, in my view. And just quite briefly, for those of you that don't know, let me just say that Kohut paid a lot of attention to his observations of certain types of patients that would come into his office, and when he would try to interpret anything to them, they would become very upset, and they seemed to simply wanting to sit there and listen to them, sit there and watch them, listen to them, and not interpret at all. And he began to realize that there was this thing called a demand for a mirror transference, a mirror transference, which is my desire to have you sit still, not call attention to yourself, and let me display myself before you as I feel that I can, to have you see me and recognize me, and no matter what I'm talking about, for you to show interest in it, and as we said earlier, not too much interest, but to show the right amount of interest in it. And Kohut began to be aware that when therapists are in the presence of this kind of demand from a patient, that the therapist feels very attacked and desirous of ending this relationship, referring the patient. They don't give the therapist enough mirroring, of themselves. So anyway, and so that was one pole of this bipolar dynamic that he noticed. The other one was the idealizing pole. And that was an idealizing transference field, where the person was looking, constantly scanning for idealizable, what Kohut calls self-objects, persons that could carry the sense of wonderfulness that the person needed to believe existed in the world. That is, somebody that could carry that sort of more than human aspect of our longings. And so in Kohut's work, he began to believe, and I think quite rightly, that as we're developing, we have these two narcissistic dynamics going on. We need somebody to see how precious we are, but see us in an amount that we can stand at any particular time, until we can gradually gain a sense of self-esteem. And that we need someone to believe in, someone larger than life, larger than human to believe in, until we can take them down slowly off of their pedestal and integrate a sense of secure values into our personality, a sense of what is really golden in human values and in the human spirit, and integrate that into ourselves. And so the task of transforming one's really sort of unregulated, exhibitionistic, demanding narcissism into healthy self-esteem on one developmental aspect there, and then transforming our need for the perfect other into values that we feel are really authentic and have integrity. Those two things Kohut saw. He opened, in my view, a real possibility for extending the discussion about the archetypal self and its dynamics and its clinical implications for Jungians, for those Jungians that have eyes to see. Because Kohut believed, and he's not a Jungian, these Kohutian self-psychologists, most of them don't know anything about Jung, and every time they discover something that Jung already discovered, they think that they're original. It's really embarrassing. I have shame reactions for them. And how completely ignorant they are about so many things. They have recently discovered the importance of art therapies for coming into touch with important dynamics in the psyche. And I'm just amazed at this brilliant discovery that they've had. But in any case, the thing that I have been so excited about the capacity to deepen our reflections on the clinical implications of the archetypal self, the great self, is that they did see. Kohut and his closest followers realized that there was this thing called the grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization in every person. It was not the ego, and was not the material human self with a little s. But that this thing existed in the psyche of every person, and every person in their maturation process had to deal with the reality of this grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization in the psyche. Now, recent Kohutians and recent self-psychologists have begun to diminish the importance of that insight. They have not really gotten the importance of that insight, and therefore they just kind of bounced off of it going right by. But you see, what they are seeing there, what Kohut saw, in my view, was the same thing that Freud was picking up on the superego and the id, the power, that huge power of those things in the psyche that had to be regulated. It's the same phenomenology that Adler intuited when he saw the presence of that ubiquitous presence of the superiority complex behind all inferiority and entitlement claims. And Jung's sense of the archetypal self as an independent psychological organization in the psyche that is not the ego and not the little s human self. That is, that there is the sense that there is this huge thing that has to be dealt with clinically and is behind addiction. It is behind for Kohutians that have thought deeply about this sort of thing. The grandiosity is a huge clinical issue for every patient. And it doesn't mean that they all are mainlining it, shooting up with it, mainlining it, as much as really what we call loosely organized personalities. But the truth is, a knowledgeable Kohutian therapist will be very aware of how you're doing regulating your grandiose exhibitionistic fantasies. Are you putting them in totally, splitting them off, putting them in the unconscious, so that you're not even aware of your grandiose fantasies? Are you that's called a horizontal split. If you are in a vertical split where sometimes you think you're Caesar and sometimes you think you're shit, but you're aware of it both times when you are in it, that's a vertical split. So that sometimes you are flying and you're wonderful and you know it, and then you're, as one man said to me this past week, and then I am in the trash can. And he knows it. So the oscillation between the presence in the conscious mind of these highly elevated, highly grandiose self states, and then terribly fragmenting and depressive positions, depleted and depressed positions. Now, I simply want to say, to give credit where credit is due, I think this was a brilliant clinical discovery. Its clinical implications of it are so important for therapists to be able to be sensitive to what's going on with the grandiosity in their patients. And in terms of the countertransference, what is going on in my grandiosity as a therapist? And how does this patient humiliate me and wound my grandiosity so that I have to act out in a hostile way toward the patient in the countertransference. So that if they bring in some display, some claim for I am so wonderful and I'm going to let you see how wonderful I am today, so that the therapist doesn't have to make a really punitive, negative, sadistic interpretation of that display. So these, and I might add, my opinion of my colleagues in the mental health professions is not high on this matter, because I personally believe, and we'll talk about tomorrow, that most therapists are so possessed by the magician archetype that they do not want to notice how sadistic they are and how much of a power trip they're in. And so we got a long way to go before we understand the narcissistic dimensions of countertransference in all therapeutic practice, no matter whether it's psychoanalytic or not. But in any case, credit where credit is due. There's awareness that grandiosity is a problem. It's always a problem. Now, what is the limitations of the Kohutian school on this topic related to what we're concerned about? Kohutians and self-psychologists in general have a kind of a fantasy that grandiosity can be done away with. That, at least that is in their theory. They have a theory that they can transmute and internalize this grandiose exhibitionistic libido, and that if you're really analyzed, then that reservoir of grandiosity will be so diminished that it will not be a big problem for you. I'm sorry. I know too many self-psychologists to believe that their grandiosity has been transmuted and internalized. And I go to the conferences where I'm an observer as an outsider, and it's really, I keep it with a good sense of humor, looking at the narcissistic posturing that I see there, and the wounding of each other that they go into in these typical ways that you all are familiar with. In short, if you buy the kind of meta-psychology of grandiosity of the Kohutians in their school, then you would have to believe, at least in theory, that you can get rid of grandiosity. This is where Jung's point of view is far superior, and it's superior in a way we must not lose, and that is that grandiosity in your psyche never goes away. It is never diminished. There is a God organization in there that we call the archetypal self, or the God complex, or the grandiose exhibitionistic imago, whatever that thing is in there, and it's not going away. You can do one of several things. You can either let it possess you, in which case you're going to have an Icarus complex, flying into the sun and crashing. Or you can pull the depressive position strategy, which is what the Adlerians and the Kohutians do, at least in their theory. That is to have the idea that real health comes by repressing the grandiosity, claiming you have transmuted and internalized it, and then hating everybody else that has good self-esteem and healthy narcissism and exhibitionism, and engaging in envy attacks, vicious sadistic envy attacks, on everyone who still has the healthy exhibitionism to put themselves forth as wonderful. And those are two strategies. One, to climb it in an unregulated way, fly into the sun and crash, get into the depressive position, and then get into which always entails an envy mode. You will set up, envy will be one of the chief ways one has of managing one's own grandiosity, because one will have idealizing projections then without even knowing it. And there will be an idealizing projection toward anyone who has healthy exhibitionistic display. And then you will attack the idealized object in various. Some are aware of it, and some and most are not. That is to say, if you will notice how uncomfortable most people are with anyone's exhibitionistic display, and how they have to depreciate it. Adler saw it. He called it the depreciation tendency. And Adler saw clearly, clinically, that the healthier you are, the less depreciation you will do of others, even if they're exhibitionistic. That the healthier you are, you will not have to depreciate others, even their exhibitionistic displays. You will be able to see the needs, the human needs and longings behind exhibitionistic displays, including the legitimate ones. So the third, say that again?
Give me idea. Hating people that are in it.
Yeah, right, because it's the same. Hating anyone for their conspicuous displays is just the same dynamic. It is a way of our managing our own grandiosity. Anytime, and hate is a big way people use to manage it, because it's narcissistic rage. I am not in touch with my grandiosity in a healthy way, and therefore I'm on the edge of narcissistic rage anyway. If I'm not in touch in a healthy way with my grandiosity, I will be on the edge always of narcissistic rage, because I feel that somebody's stolen something that's legitimately mine. Because I know in my heart of hearts that there's some preciousness in me and some worthiness in me. As the Christians would say, there's a God imago in me, there's a God image in me, the image of God is in me. And the Hindus would say that there is the Atman in me. And I say to you, thou art God. And I need you to say to me, thou art God, in order to acknowledge that thing in me that is bigger than me. And so anyway, but Kohut opened the door for us to really see these dynamics. But the Kohutians and the Adlerians and almost all other schools radically pathologize what we call narcissistic personality disorders. And that is why one of the reasons why that narcissistic personality disorders get so little help is because they're so handy for all of us to use in regulating our own grandiosity through the depressive position and hating them. And so for those of you therapists listening to this, you will be effective at helping narcissistic personality disorders exactly to the extent that you work consciously with your own grandiosity in a non-hostile way. That is, that you learn not to be hostile to your own grandiose exhibitionistic libido, your own the great things in yourself. And we'll talk tomorrow about some clues about how to relate to your grandiosity in a healthier way. But we should be clear that to get into a fantasy, as the self-psychologists do, that their grandiosity has been transmuted and internalized by their 10 years of Freudian analysis or self-psychological analysis, is a dead end. That does not work. It doesn't work because there are these enduring structures in the psyche that Jung saw that are the great self. It's huge. It will remain huge. And this is why the contribution of Edward Edinger about this developing the ego-self axis, not becoming the archetypal self, not declaring that it doesn't exist, but recognizing that it will always be present, and one's task is to relate to it consciously in a way that is optimum as possible. So that's all I want to really say about psychoanalytic self-psychology, except to say that in my personal judgment, and I by no means am idealizing them, I think there are many flaws with their treatment methods and their assumptions about treatment, and their inflated assumptions about how much they've transmuted their grandiosity and how much they can get their patients to do that. But I want to say that they have enabled us to think at the micro level, clinically, at the micro level, about these issues of the great self, the grandiosity, the grandiose energies. They've enabled us to get much more specific about seeing these energies and understanding how they impact patients. Classical Jungian analysts will interpret your dreams, and a lot of the time they will not be aware of the grandiose dynamics going on, and sometimes they will respond too enthusiastically to archetypal dreams. And the person who is already being flooded by archetypal grandiose energies, they get this positive, interested response by the analyst in material that of course is interesting and exciting, but the patient will often experience more interest for an archetypal dream than for their personal issues as being an invitation to get into their grandiosity more and to be less interested in their ordinary struggle. And so we have a lot of work to do to get therapists aware of this geography of this field of how am I to relate to my grandiosity and the grandiosity of my patient in an empathic way, which enables me to help them be interested in every part of their lives and not feel that any part of their lives is boring. That is the challenge. If you come in with one of these sizzling archetypal dreams, sure, that's interesting. I'm always fascinated by that. I could do that, 48 hours a day, But as I really get more empathic with people, I'm much more aware that even of somebody that is hugely successful in the outer world, often has so much shame over their personal life that they can hardly sit with me 45 minutes, can hardly sit in my consulting room 45 minutes if I want to hear about their personality. And what I'm saying is we have to understand what that is right there. That is a tremendous wound a shame wound, which results in a person's feeling that their personal life, the minute details of their personal life, are simply not interesting enough to be looked at together with somebody that has goodwill toward them. That's a huge topic in itself. Now let me summarize for you quickly what I have tried to do now in going beyond. I think Yo's work on this and Kohut's work on this. And what I have tried to do is to look at what I believe to be the crystalline. Jung believed that there was a crystalline structure in the archetypal self, that it was like the structure of a crystal. And if you look in his collected works, and I came to this long time ago after coming up with this sense of what the geometry of the self was, I realized that Jung had really been working on this and had many insights into it, and some of his other followers, such as Tony Wolff and others, had seen into aspects of this. And in some of my books, you can see the diagrams, elaborated diagrams on this progression of insight. But in the collected works, Jung put a number of diagrams where he asserted that the geometrical structure of the codes for the archetypal self were octahedral in shape, that is, two pyramids base to base. And he struggled to understand. He had an intuition about this, and you can look in the collected works, and you can see, and in the appendices to my books to my 4 books on the individual archetypal patterns, the king, warrior, musician, lover. In the appendix, there's a series of these diagrams that you can look at. But in any case, what I have come to understand is that I believe Jung was right, and that the great code for the shape of the archetypal self and the materials in it are octahedral in shape. And I want to go quickly through that. Some of you could give this lecture, and I don't want to bore you by going over this for a long time, but I just want to summarize it for you. If you look up here on those 2 top diagrams, imagine yourself looking down at the tops of 2 Mayan pyramids. And if you imagine those things, picking them both up this way and putting them base to base, there will be, if you place the related quadrants over each other, you will find that there are 4 faces to this octahedron. On the outer surfaces, 4 faces. One I call royal energy. It is the psychological mechanisms having to do with nurture, centering, vision, the capacity to envision a future for oneself, the capacity to choose what to build and what not to build in one's life. Imaged in many cultures in the image of a king and queen, and you see an archetypal symbolism tremendous. Jung was tremendously interested in the archetypal symbolism of the royal couple. I personally think he never figured out why that was so important, but he knew it was. So in my work, unlike Freud, who thought there was one line of development, unlike Kohut, who thought there was two, I think that according in Jung's tradition, Jung believed that there was that the psyche was a quaternio. There were four fundamental functions in the psyche. He came to believe they were typology, sensation, feeling, thinking, and intuition. Toni Wolff had a different idea. She believed they were structural forms, not typology. And I realized some time ago that I am a son in the tradition of Toni Wolff. I'm one of her intellectual sons, in that she saw the kind of structural declension that I later came to based on my own work. The four lines of development are a royal line for as I've said, for nurture and centering, envisioning, capacity to mentor, and so on, parent to parent. In other words, in my view, there's no such thing as a father archetype or a mother archetype. There's only the royal king and queen archetypes under which human mothers and human fathers seek to do their work. It tends to completely miss the numinosity in that structure, because the numinosity of parents that we try to help our clients and analisans work through is an archetypal transference of the royal couple, and the huge abyss for most of our patients between where they are and getting their parents off the pedestal, especially the bad parents, especially the quote bad parents. To get the bad parents off the archetypal pedestal is the warp and woof of most basic 101 therapy. So anyway, we've got a line of development for aggression. This has been a controversy in the history of the psychoanalytic movement for a long time. I am on the side of those that believe that aggression is a separate line of development. It is not a failed lover line. It's not a failed object relations line. That aggression is a separate line. We have evidence for this from brain physiology. These are separate systems. They're not the same. The affiliative systems in the brain are not the same as the aggressive systems in the brain. So there's a line of development for aggression from out of control, destructive aggression to regulated, creative, world building aggression. And I don't like to say, I don't consent to say assertiveness instead of aggression, because I believe that's a cosmetology approach to these energies. And I refuse to clean it up. Everyone has aggression. It's not a question of whether it's aggression or not. It's what the aggression is in service of. If one has no aggression, one will never be a successful artist. If one has no aggression, one will never be a successful lover. I mean, it's just we have to deal with all this pathologizing of aggression, which has hurt women so much in history. The identification of aggression with the male has been one of the chief strategies of patriarchy in keeping women oppressed. And the unconsciousness about the importance of maturing aggression is one of the reasons why we act such a violent country right now. Okay, so the third line of development is a cognitive line of development. I call it the transformational line because it has to do with it's the sector of development which has the awareness, the kind of consciousness that is needed to allow a person to go through transformations, death and rebirth. Jung called it the death and rebirth archetype in his work. I separate the archetype of initiation from the archetype of the magician. I think that it is in this sector that all these transition states operate. But there is a specific function of this line of development to get you the pattern recognition abilities, which are necessary if you're able to map out what's happening to you. So in other words, the capacity to see the patterns in your functioning, which is required for getting on with your journey, and which so many people coming to us in therapy lack. And so in the best sense, we help them develop their magician line of development. Hopefully, as I'll say tomorrow, we help them do more than that. But we try to give them help in learning to see the patterns of the geography of their life, so that they can recognize the repetition compulsions, which have been so destructive and continue to have their compulsive hold on them. So that is in that magician line. What else is in that? Your capacity to contemplate. That's what contemplation is, what I was just describing. Your capacity to map the human world, the terrain of the human world. Your capacity to utilize your intellectual gifts in a way that serves you in the community, in the world, instead of seeking to exploit and manipulate yourself, your community, and your world. The fourth and final line of development is what I've called the lover line, or the erotic line of development. And here again, I'm just piggybacking on Freud. You see, Freud saw the lover line. He saw clinically the aggression line. So basically, the horizontal axis here, Freud worked that territory. That line is for embodiment, sexuality, affiliation, intimacy, and the capacity for joy. And, of course, the capacity to experience your pain. I know one of the things that John does a lot in his work is try to help men be able to become aware of their pain, and that part of their task is to, instead of splitting off from their pain and acting out all the time in order to avoid their pain, to help them begin to become aware of their pain, to become aware of how they mitigate their pain with various concoctions, and the way in which they become stony cold in order to defend against their pain. And so this is something that's not just true of men, though John works mostly with men around these issues. And when this line of the lover, this erotic line develops, a person, whether male or female, is capable of becoming aware of their pain without having their pain sink their boat. Now, of course, if I had more time, I would, and I can speak to this tomorrow if you remind me, therapeutic techniques and theories of change need to be evaluated in this context, because there are a lot of therapists that assume that putting you into your pain is going to heal you. Well, it's important to have you have close encounters with your pain, but it's very important for you not to have someone lead you to believe, or you lead others to believe, that being submerged in your pain in an unbalanced way is going to heal. And there are a lot of folks dealing with trauma victims that have a very erroneous theory of change, and they think that catharsis heals. My personal view, based on this work, is that nobody ever got healed through catharsis. They find out about sectors of their personality in catharsis. So catharsis, I would argue, is a research technique. It helps you find sectors of your life that were lost in repression or split off areas, but it doesn't structure your personality. And healing, in my view, comes only through structuralization. There again, I am in the same boat, the same camp with Kohut. Healing is structuralization. Such healing as we will ever know in this life is structuralization, capacity to regulate. Okay, so we've got these 4 lines of development, 4 quadrants, as Jung said, in the personality, although I with Tony Wolff instead of Jung on what these things are. And the code, if you'll notice, and in my work I've lectured a lot on the asymmetry between males and females in terms of when in the life cycle, statistically speaking, the energies come on in a flooding way. There's a lot of cross-cultural evidence that goes against a lot of political correctness, that statistically speaking, that women become more aggressive in midlife, and men are flooded with aggression, testosterone and aggression in adolescence. And that the asymmetry between males and females developmentally that creates so much mischief in relationships at midlife is the asymmetry about when the erotic systems are to the fore in terms of sociobiological unfoldment, and when the aggression systems are to the fore. And wholeness, the task of wholeness in men and women, in my view, are exactly the same. and that is balancing these 4 lines of development adequately through the life cycle. The bad news is that it's just like a football game or a basketball game. At halftime, the ends of the court shifts, and what we tend to do is to not shift our strategies at halftime in a way that keeps our eyes open. Men in midlife have got to not forget everything they learned in the first half of life. That is, if they were able to reach their assertiveness in the first half of life. And women in the second half of life need to remember their great talents for personal relatedness, which they may at midlife have come to view as pathological. But they need to retain the capacities for empathic personal relatedness at midlife that they had when they were younger, without turning their back on the new capacities for focused aggression that a woman begins to power up with after about, I think, 35. Gloria Steinem used to say, don't send me a woman to work with me until she's 35. And what she was talking about is that's when that focused capacity to be really disciplined and aggressive really comes flooding in on a woman, statistically speaking. Now remember, no individual person, you cannot predict where they are on the 4 developmental lines by virtue of what their gender is. In my family, I was socialized into the female pattern. And many girls, particularly fathers' daughters, are socialized into a male pattern, no development early in life. So the good news is that the goal of wholeness requires the balancing of these 4 energies, 4 lines of development, regardless of your gender or where you are in life. And that is the task and always remains the task. And you can see that the balancing of the opposites is the key issue here. It's just that in midlife they play a dirty trick on us. And the field shifts, and we have to keep working on the balancing task. So there is my argument about the way that the code of the archetypal self. Now remember, this is simply the code for the foundational building blocks of the self, the little s self, to be based on these potentials in the archetypal self. There are many archetypal realities that are not archetypes of the self. And so in my other courses I've given here, they're available on tapes, I've made distinctions between complexes which are resulting from split-off aspects of the archetypal self, and complexes which are autonomous complexes which are resulting from other archetypal entities that are not a part of the archetypal self. And that's a distinction made by Jung, one that I adhere to. But in terms of our work in this, particularly with the way we're talking about this today, I'm simply focusing on the great powers here, these 4 great powers in the psyche that are archetypal and that need to be related to in a creative way in order to build an integrated, ongoing self that has the capacity to regulate. And in terms of our discussion of compulsivity, after we take a break in a little while, I will talk about what I view to be the compulsivity leading to fragmentation that is related to each of these quadrants. And but I want to open it up now for this little time that we have before the break, and have you dialogue with me about this thing about the diamond body and the codes here, because what I believe I can show here is that Kohut, when he was working with this idealizing and mirroring transferences, self-object transferences, was really talking about royal transferences, longings having to do with blessing. And if I don't get enough blessing from a parental figure or a significant other adult that I have idealized enough to be significant, you see, the Kohutians thought that these were very separate transferences. In my view, they're all part of the royal system. That is, if I do not idealize you enough, I won't care whether you mirror me or not. If I'm not already projecting royal energies on you, it won't bother me that you don't see me. Well, see, I think it's probably true that this stuff arises simultaneously in the psyche. It's like, you would have to say, you think about the infant. Because, see, the infant is not starting from a differentiated position. It started with a merger with the great one. I and you are one. You're the great one, but I'm the great one too. We are merged in this unit. So we are sort of the wonderful unit. We are sort of the wonderful reality, and really, we're really embedded in the world. The world is a wonderful reality until I start having these frustrations by the environment. And so I think that sense of the wonderful object and the wonderful me is really, that arises simultaneously because it's out of a primordial union. And then, of course, all that stuff the Kleinians talk about the good breast and the bad breast and all that sort of thing. This is the territory they're trying to work with in a very awkward and sort of fundamentalistic way, in my view. That is to say, goodness. Where is the goodness and where is the badness? Well, no, there is no badness until the frustration of my longings begin to occur. There's not any badness. And then the frustrating environment, if it's really like in our culture where we, until very recently, we would bring a baby into the world in a very cold room. And if it's a boy, we would circumcise it without anesthesia. And then we would often hold it up and slap it hard. And in other ways, traumatize this infant. And with the fantasy that people had until recently that the infant has no memory, that the infant does not feel pain. There was only until recently, there was a widely accepted theory that infants did not feel pain. And that is only recently changing, and still not changing. I would say the majority of folks still do not understand that infants feel pain and that they have memories. There's a very important wrap around that whole thing that we can't really get into today. But, the whole issue of trying to think about the evolutionary significance of Judaism in human history is an interesting area of discussion. But see, if you understand the symbolism of Judaism, I just want to say one thing about this. There are many of us that believe that Judaism, in its concept of the Sabbath, of circumcision, and there's another concept in there. I'm trying to think about it, but anyway, it had a sense of standing against grandiosity. It had a primal sense of the danger. Oh yeah, the yarmulke, the cap on the head. There are these symbolisms in Judaism that show the necessity of limiting creativity. And the mark on the penis is a sign of limiting creativity, bringing it before God. The yarmulke on the head is a sign of your covering. You understand that you have got to see a limit here on your manifestation. And the Sabbath, even God rested. Even God did not claim unregulated creativity. And so there's a whole big wrap on that. It's very complicated and very important, and I don't have time to go into it except to say that I believe they were intuiting in a very, very important way the necessity of limits on human arrogance. And the Mosaic revelation is really about containment. And to this day, what humans have learned through the Mosaic revelation is greatly at risk. Because Moloch, that is unrelenting human greed and claims to power, are more dangerous today than they were in Moses' day. So that's a whole other wrap that we don't have time to get into. But let me just open it up now. I have said then that what I've tried to do in my work is to build on Jung. I'm what I would call a neo-Jungian. That book by Samuel says Jung and the post-Jungians? Well, I personally do not identify as a classical Jungian, so I'm not a Jungian, and I do not identify as a post-Jungian like Hillman and the folks that think that they can throw out Jung's fundamental theory. I consider myself a neo-Jungian trying to do a scientific psychoanalysis that's not a Jungian cult, but does not, like Hillman and his people do, throw out Jung's the fundamental scientific work that Jung did. So what I'm trying to do is to carry a scientific psychoanalysis forward using information from as many sources as possible to carry forward Jung's project, but to become more specific than Jung was and less into mystification. A lot of Jungians don't like me and my work because they say Moore knows too much about the self. And that sounds a lot to me like he knows too much about God. But you see, I don't believe the self is God like romantic cultic Jungians do. And I believe the self is a psychological structure. And I believe, put my theological hat on, I can give you a theologian's rep, but the self is not God. The self is a psychological structure, and it thinks it's God. And it has God claims on you, and it will treat you like a very evil God. And it's the way it relates to you. But so when I do what I say, decoding the diamond body, I believe that there's enormous information, cross-cultural and interdisciplinary, that supports this, including Theodore Milan's declension of psychopathology, which fits this model. Yeah, Ann Ulanov and I independently came, Ann Ulanov, the Jungian analyst in New York, she and I independently came to a conclusion that the archetypal self is the place, if you want to talk theology and psychology, where God and the imago Dei interact, that there is that you can say there's a connection there. If you want to talk about theology, that if there is a place where God and the psyche connect, it would be in the diamond body. That would be the imago Dei. So, in other words, in my view, that if you want to speak in theological, spiritual terms of a God imago or a Buddha nature, that it is in that kind of code, that's where that would inhere. The Buddhists speak of the true person of no rank in the psyche. It's not the person, not the I, but there's the true person of no rank. I think this is the thing that Jung is really trying to talk about here. Well, I think that what you have to realize is, that is a very big area of the discussion, and I'm fascinated by that discussion. I would have to say that if you study spirituality, you will get a sense that those people, there are many, many people in different traditions that really feel that there's a tremendous sacredness in the human personality. And I don't know how many of you have ever studied Greek Orthodoxy, but the Greek Orthodox have tremendous insights about this very divine thing in the psyche. And they really, in their spirituality, they really think your task as a person is to become God. That is, they call it deification, that you really become the divine thing that you were intended to be. And Western Christians never talk about that because it scares them to death. Western Christians are very into guilt and, shame, all sorts of good stuff like that. But anyway, so there's a lot of discussion about that, and I speak about that some in my lectures on the great self within and so forth. But the important thing is to realize that whether you believe you can be an atheist. I don't care if you're an atheist. What you got to understand is that thing that they're talking about, Kundalini, that is in your apparatus. And I can put you through certain things that will put you in touch with that, and it will invade you, and you will experience it. And I don't even have to give you a psychotropic medication. I don't even have to give you a drug of any kind. I don't have to give you mescaline or peyote. I can simply get you to do holotropic breath work. And if I can get you to hyperventilate for about 20 minutes, you will start to open up to some of this archetypal energy in your psyche, and your capacity to disbelieve it will go right down the tubes, because you will feel this incredible energy in your body. And so this is really an empirical matter. Jung was an empirical scientist, and a lot of these folks that want to make him into a religious figure, a cult figure, that you have to believe everything he said based on doctrine, are forgetting how he interpreted himself. He was a scientist trying to do a scientific investigation into the farther reaches of the psyche, and I think that's what the task of scientific psychoanalysis is. A scientific psychoanalyst is not a theologian or a philosopher. We're basically plumbers, and your job is to be a good plumber, and then you can send the water off to chemists and those people that are going to tell you what it is. But you follow me? What I'm saying is that our job is to try to understand these dynamics and what appears in human life. And if you're going to be a philosopher about it or a theologian about it, you need to study philosophy and theology and get to be an expert on that, and not assume that an MD degree or an MSW or PhD makes you a philosopher or a theologian. Yeah.
The question earlier about which comes first.
Yes.
In my experience, there's just an element out there that is a hunger for certainly the idealized trend.
Yes.
Probably mirroring
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
And I usually, to a certain capacity, I want to take it on hold of one and let it go.
Yeah.
Great. Have you got ideas about that?
Yeah, about why that is. You see, I really believe that we are so bad at narcissistic nurturing people narcissistically, because we are also wounded in our own narcissism, that actually deploying ourselves in an empathic way to mirror people in a really attuned, effective way as infants on up through childhood, that we have wounded so much. So we have wounded each other in families and in culture so badly that for most people, epidemiologically speaking, just in terms of the epidemiology of this, for most people, the idea of being mirrored, having your beauty mirrored, for having somebody look at you and see beauty and preciousness, is so far away from possibility that's how we understand. This is what Kohut felt, that if you didn't get mirrored, you're going to turn to an idealizing transference to get some narcissistic needs met. But people don't understand. An idealizing transference is not the equivalent of a mirroring transference. You need mirroring. You need mirroring. There's no substitute for mirroring. There's no substitute for getting your own sense of beauty integrated in you. And the only way you can't do that through an idealizing transference. You can only do that through learning to accept being seen. And we have to, as clinicians, we have to really be sensitive to how hard it is for people to let them be seen. And these men that come to you, John, they've been shamed so and attacked so. They have had their beauty attacked. They have had their energy attacked. You know, the reason so many boy children are on Ritalin is because there is so little awareness of just the energetic differences in patterns between boys and girls. And so boys, the masculine energy in little boys is pathologized and medicated. And so that's just one current example of how hard it is for people to get mirrored. And so if they are not tremendously depressed, now this is where the depression, if you're very depressed, you will not be searching out idealizable objects. In fact, you can just tell when you're looking at yourself, if you're looking at your analysans or your clients, the depressed ones are not scanning very much for idealizable objects. They've given up. They've consciously given up, and dynamically they've given up. But Kohut is wonderful here. He reminds us, the later Kohut particularly, that if that need for the mirroring and the idealizable self-object, if that has gone to sleep and fixated because of lack of an adequate environment, milieu, it has just gone dormant, he thought. In the later Kohut, it's gone dormant. If it finds itself in an adequate milieu, that is with you, sitting with you, that after some testing, that longing will be remobilized in the relationship with you, the therapist. And so you may notice in your work with people that you'll work with them and they won't invest in you. You work with them a little longer, they won't invest in you. And you try to be as trustworthy as possible, and as empathic and related as possible. And then there will come that moment where those tentative little feelers will come out. Now, can I show you a pretty thing? And they'll test you. And then after they start feeling that they just might be able to be safe bringing that out, then it will come flooding out and scare the hell out of you, the therapist. But anyway, so the idea is that these longings will remobilize in the transference, and it's important for us to realize that those needs will become projected on us, idealizing first often. But if the psyche is less damaged narcissistically, it may go immediately into a mirror demand. So in other words, if they can show you their exhibitionism and demand that you appreciate it, that's pretty good. And if you can refrain from attacking it until after the session, you understand what I mean there? It's like the blatant. You work with somebody and they'll be very self-effacing, and then after a certain point, if they trust you enough, they will bring in that thing that they felt so much shame about, and that is their spiritual experience, which makes them very special. They talk to the Archangel Michael or Krishna or whoever it was, and they will bring this shining little diamond in there, and they'll put it there, and they'll watch you, see how you respond. And folks, it's very important for you to control your communications of contempt or shock or, oh my God, well, envy and jealousy, certainly, but what we tend to do in this flatland, Ken Wilber's work, if you studied any Ken Wilber, it's very important work. You need to study Ken Wilber to get a feeling of the flatland world of contemporary mental health. And so, the idea that somebody that brings in an experience with Krishna is really, my God, I thought they were this, but they're really a borderline, or they're worse. They're really a borderline or worse. And you got to control that socialization and just understand that they have just brought in this part of, what is that they say in Hinduism, Randy? What's that thing about the necklace of, is it the necklace of Indra? Indra's necklace or something. They have just brought in this divine string of pearls to show you. And the task here, folks, is to not give them a pathologizing stare. You follow me? And because if you do give them a pathologizing stare, is you're well, you're playing. Well, that's only poetic justice, if some secular psychotherapist gets attacked by the Kundalini from behind. Right, a behaviorist, look out, all you behaviorist atheists on this tape, listening to this tape. Just remember that your shadow is one of these psychotic spiritualities, like, that you have a Jungian psychotic spiritual shadow. Okay, any other questions or comments? At any point in the life cycle, it's going to be a challenge for people of different genders to have empathy for each other at all periods in the life cycle. The predatory male behavior on young females in early life is a function of lack of empathy for young females on the part of young males. And the midlife phenomenon that we see between men and women is that increasingly you will notice that at midlife women become less and less empathic with the personal issues of men as they get older. That's epidemiological. I mean, that's anybody that doesn't see that is not looking. Contemptuous and also extremely self-righteous about it. I mean, and what people have to realize is that this thing is not personal. It's fueled by sociobiological agendas, and that the challenge for us all, spiritually and emotionally and ethically, is to find every way we can to enhance empathy for the genders have to have more empathy for each other through the life cycle, and the problems change through the life cycle, so that you can see why it's so difficult, because there's an asymmetry there that this guy, what's his name, John Gray, picked up in that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Well, John is half right. And women are from Venus statistically in the first half of life. But after the first half of life, women are from Mars and men are from Venus. And yes, go ahead. Of course. And you can see that May-December relationships, they totally make sense, but they're not really very mature. Because what it amounts to is, rather than integrating the shadow and trying to gain empathy for the other gender, what one does is fragment and then find somebody that it's narcissistically easier to relate to. And so, well, you could write the book on this. I mean, if you just think about it, older women, younger men, older men, younger women, they've got a lot in common, dynamically speaking, statistically, in terms of the probabilisms. And so it is a challenge for people. What was the name of that movie? That I just saw it last night. That Sean Connery and it was about an older couple. It was about their 40th anniversary celebration. No, it's a different one. This is about a 40th anniversary celebration of Sean Connery and his wife, who's played by a beautiful aging actress, and it's really about some of this stuff, all this stuff. It's a beautiful movie. I wish I could think of the name of it.
I worked in an all-black school,
Mhm.
10% white, as an officer private practice. And I would say the second fifth of the younger generation. The women that I'm working with at that school are extremely warrior. You know, they're gangbangers, it's a junior high, they're constantly violent. You know, we had a kid try to kid. And over the other day, it was a woman, but it was a second, and I don't know. And there's no nurturing coming out of it.
Well, that's a long story. She's talking about the phenomenology we're seeing in young female gang members. And yeah, I know, but don't kid yourself. If you look at the statistics on violence, women are getting more violent, but they are so far behind males in violence that it's really acute missing of the statistics to say that women are becoming as violent as men, because frankly, there's absolutely no evidence that women are ever going to be as violent as males. And that's what's happening. That is to say that the social vessels which have regulated aggression in both male and female are collapsing, and therefore, as young women in gangs, for example, have less effective female mentoring by mature women, they do what always happens in a patriarchal culture. They look at patriarchal values modeled by the powerful young male gangbangers, and they emulate that in order to gain status. This is not, doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out what's happening there. So anyway, let me just talk briefly now about compulsivity and the archetypal press through these quadrants. And I just want to just talk about this briefly. There's a lot that can be said about this, but I just want to emphasize the difference between my thought and so much contemporary thought on compulsion and a number of other psychopathological patterns. What I'm arguing here is that to the extent, here's my fundamental assumption that we can elaborate and as we go, that each archetypal line of development is a huge challenge for the emerging human self, little s self. It's a huge challenge for the person to be able to draw upon that archetypal foundation in a constructive, creative way. Given our families, our cultures, our religions, our families, our birth order, the particular trajectory of trauma that we've experienced as persons, we will have been helped, blessed, or hindered and cursed in ways that affect the integration, the adequate integration of these potentials in our functioning self system. Now, here is another fundamental assumption. To the extent that you have been able to take in this building block of a particular line of development, draw upon it in a creative way for your self-functioning, that sector will be less compulsive. It will be more optimally regulated and become less problematic for the person. To the extent that that particular sector has been cursed or ignored or neglected in the developmental process of the person, that sector of the psyche will be the locus of invasions, possessions, flooding, compulsivity. So what I'm suggesting to you here, for example, is that just as Kohut showed us that narcissistic pathology does not simply apply to narcissistic personality disorders, I'm suggesting to you that compulsivity does not just apply to compulsive disorders or addictions. That in fact, the narcissistic personality disorder is a compulsion. It is a royal compulsion. The individual, the person with a narcissistic personality disorder is not, you're not seeing their human personality, you're seeing a compulsive invasion pressing into their little s or ego space of this royal archetypal energy. Why? Because it has not been adequately related to in their developmental process. How do we know? Well, you simply look at persons with narcissistic personality disorders, and they did not have attuned mirroring. If they had had attuned mirroring in their developmental process, they would have developed self-esteem, more adequate self-structure, and they would not be flooded with this raw, primitive demand for mirroring. You follow? So in other words, what I want to suggest to you is that what we've got to do when we're thinking about psychopathological patterns and symptoms is we simply need to start being a lot more sensitive here. We need to say, where is the compulsivity? We know that the compulsivity is going to come not from something personal. The compulsivity comes from the impersonal power circuits in the personality, these archetypal quadrants. So let me run through this one time and then we'll discuss it before we take our break for the night. Okay, I'll just finish with what I was saying there. If you are being flooded with royal energy from the royal quadrant in your psyche, you will be, your ego awareness and your little s self will be flooded with these demands for mirroring from others. You will not be into idealizing transferences at all. Narcissistic personality disorder cannot form an idealizing transference. That's why it's so hard to treat them. So the good news about being a Jungian in your approach to treatment is you can help people without them idealizing you. Although we've got a lot of Jungian analysts that demand idealization. But there's no, well, right, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll say, clearly my narcissistic house is not in order. And I've had more analysis than any other living person. But in any case, I'll just say that, but the Jungian theory and its actual approach to therapy does not require any idealizing transference, because if they can dream, you can work with them. If they can, this is the catch, if they can stand to have you give attention to their dream instead of to them, you can help them. Some people are so narcissistic in the royal way that they're jealous of their dreams and they're envious of their imaginal products, and so they cannot stand for you to work with they won't bring you a dream. And the reason they won't bring you a dream is they don't want to share you with the dream. Do you follow that? So what do you do in that case? Well, you simply work with your presence. You try to have a very modulated, calm presence, which is easier said than done. And I have found that you have to, we don't have time to go into this today, we can talk about it more tomorrow, but I have found that you really have to get good at communicating between the lines with a narcissistic personality disorder. They've got to be able to tell that you care for them without having to admit that they care. So anyway, so if you want to understand the compulsivity of the royal sector, you simply look at the phenomenology of the narcissistic personality disorder. This person is not choosing to be arrogant, my friends. That's what I'm saying. You have to understand that this person is not choosing to be an arrogant SOB. They have been invaded, or they were either invaded or they never were given the help they needed to exclude this huge energy from their self-sector, a little less self-sector. If the parental environment was so unattuned, then they have never had a chance to push back the demands of the great self to have any space for their little human being. And so we could say that we have to crank up our empathy for how little space the little human in them has ever had because of the inroads of this great thing into their ego precincts. So that's the royal sector, compulsivity, and you can see that in differing degrees. For example, the histrionic personality disorder, you can see some of the inroads of this there too. Although it's not nearly as flagrant as in the narcissistic personality disorder. The histrionic wants your attention, and you can see the royal demand there. But their ego is not really centered in this sector. They've got a lot of this erotic stuff in them too. And in the erotic sector, there will tend to be a compulsive search for the gold outside. And passive dependent personality disorders and histrionic personality disorders are compulsively object-oriented. Even though in that histrionic, you can still see the bleeding through of some of this royal stuff. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but when a histrionic personality is recruiting you, there's a lot of demand in that recruitment. And like I never will forget the persons that would come to cocktail parties and would come up to me and say, "You're ignoring me, aren't you?" That's a typical histrionic line, said in half jest, but just half jest, and so you can see some of the royal bleeding into the histrionic too, but it's royal. It's a mixture of royal and erotic energies in histrionic. In that the compulsivity in the histrionic and both the passive dependent and active dependent personalities is that compulsive overvaluing of the object, the compulsive experience of the center out there, not in here. And so let's look at the compulsive invasion of this line of aggression, warrior energy. To give me examples of manifestations of compulsivity around the invasion of the aggressive line. Development. Give me an example of that from your verbalizations on others. That would be a kind of an invasion. The person has very little empathy, and one of the things you can tell if the aggression line is pressing in, there's very little empathy. And often very little awareness that the aggression is aggression. We find this a lot in people who perpetrate verbal abuse. Most of the people who are verbally abusive do not think of themselves as at all being abusive. They really consider themselves to be quite self-righteous. So there's a lack of awareness of the discharge of aggression. In other words, this is kind of unregulated aggression, but the ego consciousness does not recognize it as such. And the same thing is true about the kind of gratuitous aggression that you see in domestic violence. This is a bleeding through of this aggression sector of the psyche, and even in repeated patterns of perpetuation of domestic violence, the ego consciousness of the perpetrator is often very unaware of how much aggression is coming through their personality. Yeah. Well, clear. I mean, I can't go into. Right. That's right. I can't go into treatment patterns about that in detail now, but simply to say that when you're dealing with that has to be confronted, but it has to be confronted empathically. That is to say, you've got to try to make an alliance with a human being in there, because you're dealing with a killer, but that killer's not a person. That's an archetypal force, and it is managing to dissociate the personal psyche. The psyche is in a state of dissociation in domestic violence perpetrators. This is what's not understood. And this aggression is really, in fact, one of the rules you can say is when the little s self, the human self or the ego awareness of a person is being compulsively flooded by aggression, it is dissociating that psyche. And very likely, if you trace the history of that person, their very pattern is because they were victims of unregulated aggression. There's a lot of evidence for that. But unregulated aggression is almost always fragmenting. I would say it's always, in my view. You've got to see the treatment strategies in domestic violence have got to get out of assuming these are bad men, morally bad men. There's got to be a combination of very, very heavy stainless steel containment and confrontation with an attempt to make an empathic connection with the human being in there. And there's usually so much self-righteous rage on the part of the treatment team that they have very little empathic capacities to actually be in a treatment mode with the person. And so that is, I agree with the feminist that these individuals have to be effectively confronted about how destructive their unregulated aggression is, and I mean consistently confronted in a stainless steel vessel way. However, I don't agree with the treatment strategies that have become very popular around the country that dehumanize the perpetrator. And the truth is, these archetypal energies that are possessing them and leading to this unregulated aggression, that is not human. That's transpersonal forces, and they are as much, in some ways, the victim of that as their victims. But what I'm saying is the requirement of empathy in people who would be therapists is huge, and we honor it mostly in the breach, even when we're not dealing with domestic violence perpetrators. If it's harder to be empathic with anyone, if it's more difficult than with a narcissistic personality disorder, it's with a sociopath or a domestic violence perpetrator or a sexual abuse perpetrator. But what we have to realize is that all these individuals are being colonized by incredibly powerful forces that they have never been helped to develop a vessel for. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about the task of creating that inner vessel, which is required for anything remotely resembling a healthy self, a little less self. When you get down to the borderline, you're getting to the place where the structure is very on and off. And so a borderline personality is a person that is all over these quadrants in a kind of a wobbling way. In other words, a borderline, I love borderlines. I think they are incredibly fascinating, and the reason is they are so close to the fire. There's not very much human self there. in a borderline. It's very flickering. The human self-organization in the borderline flickers. It's more on than off, but it's like the flickering teleporter in Star Trek. And when you look closely at a fairly severe borderline, you're going to be real close to the angels, gods and goddesses. And now you're going to see absolutely brilliant insights, absolutely transpersonally brilliant insights. Now you're going to see incredible transpersonal aggression coming at you, man. I mean, coming at you, intending to kill you and salt the earth that you came out of. And then you're going to have incredibly hot, erotic stuff coming at you, which looks at you and which sees how beautiful you are. And the borderline is going to see right into your erotic needs. And they're going to see right into the place where your erotic needs are not fulfilled. And they're going to come right in there and say, and I can fulfill them. And then they're going to come right in there and they're going to be able to see you in an incredibly loving and nurturing way. And it's totally unlike we stereotype borderlines. They can be tremendously spiritually prescient and incredibly revelatory. And you can hear the voice of God coming right from, Jesus coming right, the real voice, the real avatar coming right through that borderline. What you got to understand is that what you're experiencing is not personal. They are so close to the fire that they're just mediating all kinds of transpersonal energies a lot. And if you have the eyes to see, you can see the enormous beauty of the human psyche in the life of the borderline, and you can see what in some ways, what a grace and gift they are to the rest of us. Well, you acknowledge all the presences, but you try to form an alliance with that little seed in there of the emerging true self, which, contrary to the Kernbergs and the early Kohut and those people, they pathologize borderlines far too much. That is, a borderline has tremendous capacity for healing if they can find the right therapist who has some smarts and street savvy. A therapist to work with a borderline has to have enormous street savvy. You can't just be a cute professional therapist. You got to be willing to wrestle. It hadn't given up its ego. The borderline is not psychotic. They only fly close to psychosis now and then. And they're not really psychotic. And so you see, we've got to really watch this. The reason we really want to pathologize borderlines too much is that we're really, especially to the extent that you're not a little crazy yourself as a therapist, you are terrified of a borderline. And why are you terrified? You think it's because of their pathology. It's not. It's because that's exactly it. Because a borderline will present the numinous to you. And you're confronted with it. You can't ignore the numinous when you're with a borderline patient. It's a lot easier to ignore it when you're with a narcissist. A narcissist, you can just hate their guts. and kind of think you're self-righteous about it, But when you're with a borderline, the numinous is coming through there, and all of your little radar that says, angels and gods and everything are in the presence, are clicking in. Even though you're a secular atheist, there's something in you that's saying, numinosity is here. And you've got, especially if you're a flatland secularist, you have got a huge, just like Lionel Corbett, a real smart friend of ours that's out at Pacifica. He used to talk about, and I think it's a very apt phrase, the defense against the numinous. And persons who are really sort of secularist flatlanders who don't really know anything about spiritual traditions, have never had any religious experiences that they're aware of, except on dope. Usually not very much, even when on dope. They're, what's that word we use when we're talking about the handicap now? What do we call them? Challenged. These people are numinously challenged. And so when they are with a borderline, they have to really pathologize the borderline, because if they don't, the borderline is going to be a medium figure for them. Yeah, that's such a crock of manure. That's malpractice in my view. That's malpractice in clinical education. Anybody that tells you you cannot treat borderlines is totally full of it. And that's just sad because, the mental health industry has been taken over by greed and money and money mongers. And you know what? You can't treat borderlines with brief therapy and pills. That is, you're not going to help them much. It's going to take a lot of wrestling to help a borderline. And not only that, you're going to, and we'll get into this tomorrow right before we stop. We're talking about sort of street magic for working with really sick people. And what you got to do is you have got to get out of, as a therapist, you've got to be in touch with the social systems in your city. And you have to be able to utilize every self-object milieu resource that you possibly can. That is to say, if you've got a borderline and they're not connected to a religious community of some kind, you have to figure out how you're going to help them choose a religious community to get involved in where being into the stuff they're into is not so pathologized. And I don't care if it has to be an alternative religion of some kind. I have seen, a lot of people like to run down the so-called cults. And they're a bunch of idiots as far as I'm concerned, because there's more practical psychotherapy done by minority religions in this world than is done by all of our mental health practitioners put together. And it has to do with providing community, a place to live, rituals which help to contain all that incredible, what's that we call it? We call it the, when you're really getting crazy along the magician line, it's, I'm blocking it there. Well, as Milan talks about it, you get crazy along these different lines and you start being a schizotypal, right? You're not schizophrenic yet, but you're schizotypal. Well, what that means is, you know what schizotypal means? It means you know about angels. If you believe in angels, you got a little schizotypal stuff, or if you believe in spirits and that sort of thing. And so if you can help a borderline find a context where they can have a cognitive framework connected to other people, which gives them a way of talking about what they know to be true. You see, they know that these entities exist. And they have been having what Adler called their own little private philosophy, their own private logic to explain them. Well, if you got a private logic to deal with angels, then you're crazy. If you're in a group of people that have a group philosophy to deal with angels, you're in a minority religion, or you're a Catholic, or a Jewish mystic, and it depathologizes it. So we'll get into that more tomorrow. But this is back toward, in other words, the press I would make and do make about practical psychotherapy, those that really want to help people, particularly those that don't have enough money to do long-term analyses, is we have to use community mental health approaches like we used to talk about back in the early 60s. But we got to do it in a much more sophisticated way by drawing on all sorts of resources to help people be grounded physically, grounded in relationships, grounded in communities, where they can optimize the levels of support they have to contain these energies that keep flooding in from the inner world. Let's see, we've got a few more minutes. Any other comments or questions about now? Let me just review, see. What I'm arguing is that compulsivity always is grounded in archetypal invasions. That archetypal invasions will always lead to dissociation and fragmentation in the personality systems, always. What we have to do in scientific psychology and psychoanalysis is we've got to stop oversimplifying things, and we've got to look at what we can know about the fundamental configurations of these impersonal forces that prey upon budding egos and little less human selves as they're struggling to learn how to regulate, so that instead of treating every patient the same way, we can actually do a real differential diagnosis and not just have it be a labeling, which is what it is now. Most of our so-called differential diagnosis is just getting the right label out of the DSM-4. It does not really have a dynamic grasp of what this phenomenon is. And what I propose is that we learn to do a structural analysis, which will actually tell us where this self is failing. Where is this self, this human little s self, where is it failing? Where is it fragmenting and why? What's its weakest link? Why is it collapsing there? Why is it vulnerable by archetypal contents in that sector? And then in our therapy, as we'll talk about tomorrow, in our therapy, we need to be able to give specific attention to the particular failure in the self-organization, so that, as we say in contemporary self-psychology, before we can heal this person in terms of a real integration of structure, a real structuralization, at least at the beginning, we can help them find the right prosthesis, the right psychological and relational prosthesis, crutch, to help them function and not be destroyed while we work with them on actually structuralizing. Do you follow what I'm saying there? Now, that's what this is all about. Now, let me just open it up now, for we've got a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead, and then John. Well, see, that whole question is what I was addressing in that course I gave here on angels, demons, and spirit possession. It's important clinically, from a Jungian point of view and from my point of view as a structural analyst, to be able to distinguish between archetypal contents, which are what Jung called personally related and need to be integrated, as in a shamanic soul retrieval approach to healing. See, most therapies that have some dynamic insights are sort of shamanic in their model. They have the idea that you go out and you retrieve this lost part, like a Gestaltist do that way. Freudians, they want to reclaim things that are repressed or split off, and try to bring them in, and certainly Kohutians are into integrating things and trying to transmute and internalize all that fantasy. But Jung had an understanding that there were also psychological entities in the archetypal unconscious. And remember, you can't assume that they are external. You can't, as a psychologist, a scientific psychologist, you're not making metaphysical claims about whether they have an existence independent of the human psyche. As a scientist, you're simply dealing with what appears phenomenologically in the psychic realm. You have to bracket those ontological questions until you are willing to do your philosophy and take that on. But clearly there are archetypal entities, which I will share with you some tomorrow, which will come into the precincts of the ego that are not supposed to be in the precincts of the ego. And they're not supposed to be identified with. Some of these are benign, but yet still not supposed to be identified. For example, if you're a songwriter and you get in touch with your muse, or if you're an artist and you get in touch with your muse, often they project it on women friends or men friends, But if you start to identify with your creative muse, it will destroy you. You'll become an addict, because if you identify with creativity, you're going to die. I mean, that's why there's so much death among creative artists, and why they have such a bad time surviving. So that's a benign, but you don't want to try to integrate it and merge with it. And there are archetypal entities, I've done a lot of this in my lecturing on evil, which are not personal, and which are very toxic, and which create a lot of compulsivity. Remind me to talk about this tomorrow. I think a lot of suicidal ideation and a lot of compulsive suicidal behavior, I do not think that's personal. I don't think that's personal at all. I think that's transpersonal. I think that's an invasion of some of these very toxic spirit complexes. And I think that one of the most important things to do with suicidal patients is to really confront the necessity for them to distinguish between their true self and this voice that is telling them to kill themselves. Because the true self will never tell a person to commit suicide unless they are dying of Lou Gehrig's disease or something like that. You can see some life-affirming suicides in terms of terrible illness, terrible painful illness, but most suicides are not that. Most suicidal persons that are really suicidal are having compulsive voices and urges to kill themselves. This is not personal. in my view. This is an example of what Jung called a spirit complex that's very toxic. And you've got to get the person to disidentify with that voice. Say, this is not you. You have to fight that. You have to fight that. You have to fight that. That's trying to kill you. And even the British object relations theorists who are as atheistic as they can be, and they're not Jungians at all, they don't care about that at all. They see this thing. And they talk about that as the antilibidinal ego. And in other words, there's an I in the psyche, which is not the true self. And it wants you to kill you. And it's very important. We should come back to that tomorrow. Well, see, that would be one way of spiritually of talking about this kind of thing. But anyway, so tomorrow we should come back to that. And remember, I asked you to see if you can think of a dream that you'd feel comfortable sharing that might show some compulsivity, either a dream of your own or a dream of someone that you have permission to consult with others on. We'll keep this confidential. And think of any clinical vignettes that you'd be willing to share where you've observed compulsivity, and then we'll try to talk about it, and I'll try to help you think about what's going on. But we will spend the first part of the morning talking about patterns in clinical practice that you may be able to observe in dreams and so on. And then after our break, we'll talk about strategies in integrative psychotherapy, and I'll just talk about a little bit more about the difficulty that occurs because the therapist is too possessed by the magician, and why it makes us less effective as therapists when we're too possessed by this magician fantasy of our being the great magician, we're the great wise ones, and this cripples our ability to help people. And then finally, we will talk about more about what I say. We've got to do structural diagnostics in order to optimize our effectiveness. And then we'll talk about some of these integrative interventions and what an integrative intervention is. And in my view, we have got to go back to the community mental health models, but do them in a much more sophisticated way, picking up on what we now know about ritual processes that we didn't know then, and the positive importance of ritual processes, of humor, of other kinds of resources that, in other words, the optimum utilization of adjuncts to therapy. Getting to the point where you're very clear that you are not the therapist. You should be someone who orchestrates this healing process. You're more like a conductor, or you're more like someone who mentors a healing process once you get clear on what's really wrong. Because my understanding of this is that it takes a whole community to heal a person. And healing is a processual thing. It's not a state. And what we've got to do is to get much more sophisticated in ways that we can mobilize communities in such ways that they're able to deploy themselves for helping people regulate. You follow me? So we'll talk about that a lot more tomorrow. Yeah. Well, let me comment on that for the tape. We've just begun our discussion of strategies in integrative psychotherapy based on the structural analysis. And one of our class members was just saying that as she has worked on trying to integrate her aggressive systems into her self-system, the warrior function, she's found it very helpful to make sure that she's trying to bring that into relationship. And she feels that is her way of developing membranes which help her protect herself. And I think that's a very, very good way to think about it. In fact, any of these systems need to be brought into embodiment in relationship and community. As we go for the rest of our time today, we will be talking about that community dimension and relational dimension. That has got to be a part of any serious attempt to integrate these systems. I said yesterday that I would just say a little bit more about the shadow of the healer. And I want to give you a reference then until I can get this stuff published. There's an essay in a book called Healing and the Healer, edited by George Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S. And I published this thing called The Self and the Shadow of the Healer. Perspectives from Structural Psychoanalysis as a chapter in that book. And in that, I simply talk about the way in which therapy as a professional kind of function has developed under the aegis, under the image of the magician archetype. And most therapists have not done any kind of archetypal studies. Therefore, they don't really understand the power of the image that they're operating under and the way it controls the therapist and the process of what happens in therapy. In fact, if you will look at the way in which Freudians the therapeutic process, the transference, countertransference relationships, their fantasy of abstinence, their fantasy of clean relationships between the analyst and the analysand. The professional model picks up on this and really emphasizes how you must not have any real personal connection with the people you work with and so on. If you study the professional model of helping professions, and you look at the classical models of containment in psychoanalysis, you really see the way in which the magician archetype is just running rampant in their conceptuality, and they don't really know what it is. They don't know what the magician archetype is. They don't know how it dominates them in an impersonal, compulsive way. And it dominates what they can do in therapeutic intervention. So the very idea of having a person being in therapy with a person who cannot see you is a radical magician move. To have them that they can't see your face, that's a radical magician move. That is to disappear from the view of the person you're trying to help. It's also a radical power move. And in the shadow of the magician, the dialectical shadow, if we look here, if the magician, if we're talking about the face of the structure of the self that's a magician, and if this is dominant, what is dialectically across from it? It's the royal, the power agenda. And since in a therapist, I'm not trying to have power over you. I'm really abstinent. I'm just really sitting here taking notes. I'm not into a power trip. I'm not being, the Freudians have this incredible fantasy of how by being in this invisible place that they are not influencing the environment, which is ridiculous. This is really a ridiculous joke. It is so unsophisticated. How could anybody make such an unsophisticated assertion if they were not possessed by an image? All the studies we've got show that everything is an intrusion. Everything you do is an intrusion. If you don't have any pictures on your wall, that's an intrusion. If you have pictures on your wall, that's an intrusion. So you're going to be presenting. There's a form demand to any way you present, and anybody that thinks there's not is just I can't help them. But anyway, so you got this power agenda here. This power agenda. Well, if you're so dominated by, if you've got an obsessive preoccupation with some theoretical dogma, that cannot be discussed, which is what happens in these circles. But anyway, look at the power agenda here. See, that's the power agenda. And to the extent that you're just retreating in this magician thing, you've also got aggression and erotic agendas. And if you want to know why there's so much sexual acting out on the part of therapists, it's because this magician thing is so dominant. Because if the magician thing is really that dominant, that means that you are not aware of how aggressive you're being, and you're not aware of how erotic you're being, and you're not aware of how much into a power trip you are. And so you can actually see the impersonal structure of our profession and the way in which so much sadomasochistic abuse of clients, both in acts of commission and acts of omission, which gets me to, the thing that Nell brought up yesterday about the case management model. That is to say, a therapist that thinks they're superior because they will not think about mobilizing resources on behalf of their client or analysan is sort of possessed by the magician archetype. The idea that you somehow ruin the therapy if you seek to mobilize other adjunct resources for the healing process is an amazing detachment fantasy. I'm not in community with you. When we terminate, you will no longer exist for me. That's that kind of fantasy. So in any case, look at that essay, and I've just kind of barely scratched the surface in that, but it's something that if we thought about, it would expose a lot of the dynamics of these crazy dynamics in these training institutes, because it would say to our analytical colleagues, look, you have to get conscious about your aggression and manage it, regulate it. And stop retreating into this magician persona and melding with it, So let me just talk now about some strategies. First, we've been talking about structural diagnostics, and this weekend we've been talking about compulsivity, which I'm encouraging you to become more aware about when you're doing reflection on your cases, whether the case is you or whether it's someone else. And so let's just take a few moments and let's talk about the marks of compulsivity. And when you notice compulsivity, what are some of the flags that have been helpful to you to notice when compulsivity is present? So let's just say from your own practice, from your own work with yourself, how do you know when you're being compulsive? And how do you know when somebody else is being compulsive? So let's just open it up and let's just get a few of these out on the table, because it's not, this is not rocket science. I mean, you see what Nell is saying. She's describing in a certain sector, certain type of personality. She's speaking of people who are dealing with addictions. Now, in my work, I view addictions as the clearest example of the flooding of the lover sector, compulsivity in the lover sector. And she is describing something that she's noted phenomenologically about folks that are having trouble getting this flooding lover energy contained. Understand, lover doesn't mean it's good. Love and death are in fact closely related. Woody Allen was right. You can fly right into that flame and disappear. So she's noting, though, the inability to act. Now, ask yourself, what is structurally dialectical to the lover? It is the warrior. It is the capacity to act. There's only one source of focused action in the structure of the psyche, and that is in these warrior systems. They are about doing. They are not about being. They are about doing. And so even a person with a lot of royal energy that is really crippled in the warrior, they cannot act. So what she's showing us is a clear expression in her own experience of the dialectical shadow of these people. They are out of touch with those action circuits right now, and they are that way not because they don't have them. And those people that say they can't be helped, you see, that is ridiculous. These systems are in the psyche. We know they're in the psyche. We know that the aggressive systems are in the psyche. We've got neurophysiological evidence that these are clear systems. And they're either online or they're not. And if the person is not brain dead or have a massive organic brain syndrome, these systems can be brought online again. The question is, how do you do it? You see, but the problem is that the human person that's aggressive, or is that something else? What is it that she's wedded to? She's talking about a person who's a compulsive victim. Now, do you see she's describing the way a person who is kind of in her conscious mind seeks to center itself in terms of this kind of masochistic pattern. But we notice this fury that's coming in trying to compensate that, see? But one thing that you know, this whole axis is not structuralized, because we're getting raw, primitive, erotic stuff in the masochism, and we're getting the raw dialectical shadow coming through in the rage and the fury. So you got a real challenge here, because this person is operating in a very this is very overheated dialect. Okay, now just in terms of practical psychotherapy, if you've got somebody that is flooded with the lover erotic energies a lot, whether they're depressed, whether they're addictive, or whether they're in a victim pattern like this, what is the most effective strategy to try to start containing this? Is it putting energy into getting them more into lover energy, or putting energy into getting them more into linear space? Think. Is there any way to fix the lover problems of this person by addressing the lover sector? No. Do you understand do you see this? You cannot fix the lover sector on its own. Why can't you? Formless. It is the essence of unstructure. It is a solvent. You cannot build structure in the lover sector alone. It has to have containment by the other aspects of the psyche. So in terms of practical psychotherapy, you got to understand this, because if you don't understand this, you will end up as a therapist getting her into catharsis, encouraging her to talk about her victimization, encouraging her to talk about her abuse. Do you see this? A lot of therapists don't understand this. A lot of therapists will think they're being helpful if they go with the person into their pain, go with the person into their abuse, recount the abuse again, recount the victimization again. The therapist, many of our therapists, I tell you, if we did a survey and it was honest, if we had an honest survey of therapeutic techniques in the United States, you would find an incredible number of therapists that assume that the way you deal with unstructured lover problems is to get them onto their feelings. That is wrong. It is malpractice in my view. And so what the only thing you can do, if I am flooded with lover stuff, I'm going to try to merge with you. I'm going to try to get you to be in my mishigas. Right? You're going to just come in here and in the hot tub with me. Right? I mean, get in here in the smelly stuff with me, and let's just merge in the pain and suffering and in our little bath here. That is not going to help her. And the therapist needs to understand that in this kind of situation, you have got to find a way. First of all, you have to be doing your own royal work so that you can be calm. Because it's very important for you to be able to be calm, and for this person to understand that you're not afraid, that you're not anxious about this. So that's an important thing, and that's your own centering work, and we'll get into that more in a minute. But in terms of intervention, the way to intervene most effectively with this person is not even through interpretation. So that's a magician thing, and the magician thing doesn't work effectively with this. What you've got to do is to be, am I a behaviorist? You bet. And all therapy has got, if it's not a joke, it's got to have behavioral elements. And so, especially with a person that's having lover problems, you have to mentor that sector of the psyche which can operate linearly. Because if it's a lover person, they do not operate in linear time. You have to understand, they are not in linear time. Now, that's hard for you to get your mind around, but if you study these configurations as I've presented them, you can get a feeling for this. Lovers are in eternity, not time. You follow me? So you must understand that these archetypal configurations have their own view of time. They have their own view of body, world, others, everything, and they're discrete. What you got to understand is I'm telling you these things are discrete, and you can learn to recognize where a person is by how they talk and how they present. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. So how do you get a person in linear time? Well, you focus on helping them with you. You serve the self-object function for the efficacy needs. Taking up Wolf's work there. In other words, what is in that warrior sector that you're going to have to help them with? Well, if you look at the self-psychology way of talking about this, which I think is accurate. I believe that Ernest Wolfe is probably the greatest living self-psychologist anywhere. And his work, which I want to recommend, he's been my wife Margaret's teacher of all this stuff, and I've learned it through her. But anyway, the book called Treating the Self. That may not be right. I'll have to think about that. But anyway, it's the book where he goes over his declension of this stuff. And you got the efficacy systems, the aversive systems, and the adversarial systems. The aversive stuff, you've got to help this person be clear about where she needs to form boundaries. And instead of just talking about forming boundaries, you have to break that down in incremental behaviors. See, you've got to be the most radical behaviorist with a person like this. And you've got, because, it doesn't make you not analytical if you understand what you're doing. I mean, because what you're doing is you're trying to evoke you're trying to boot up this warrior system. Just like on a computer, you're trying to boot it up. It's not booted up. Well, she is trying to find the aggression. You got to understand, a masochist doesn't really want to be hurt. You got to get past that. The true self of a masochist does not want to be hurt. You're dealing with impersonal forces. The impersonal forces in the psyche it's an enantiodromia. It's not personal. This person is not wanting to be hurt, but they intuit that there's this big hole in the psyche which aggression is supposed to fill. In other words, you have to stay with the structure of the particular person you're dealing with, and don't assume presence of archetypal configurations that are not evident to you. But go ahead. And the trap, you see, with such a person would be to spend all your time in the therapy simply interpreting. Her problem is not that she does not know. See, this is not a problem about knowing. It's a problem about doing. And it's only after she gets help from the self-object therapist, the therapist as sort of transitional self-object, you can help her boot up this I've said the aversive first, that's the boundary. The adversarial to understand that she needs to pick her battles. And you have to help her figure out what battles to fight when. Because see, if you're in the lover space, all time is simultaneous. And all battles are simultaneous if you're flooded with lover energy. In other words, you can't organize. You can't organize your treatment plan if you're in that lover flooding. So what you as the therapist have got to do is to pick up and offer a self-object function where, in other words, here's a fundamental strategy that I argue should be followed in integrative psychotherapy. You need to figure out where the largest structural deficit in the personality is. Then you need to try to mobilize yourself as a self-object to help boot up the system that will help this person get most organization in the least time. So I'm suggesting to you that here you're having to be the most effective and in both structuralization and in time, brevity, will be for you to serve as the warrior self-object who can help her choose battles, get into linear time, and ask the question, what does she need to do to become effective in her life? In order to do that, she's got to ask what she wants to do. Now there's where you're getting into you begin to serve as a royal self-object too. Most of your clients that are real regressed cannot imagine what they want to do. You follow me? Because they are like that old thing, they're out there in the swamp filled with alligators trying to drain it, and it's awful hard to keep your mind on what you're trying to do if you're fighting off alligators all the time, if they're crisis dominated. Well, I think it's very interesting if if you're doing supervision or you're working with people that are working clinically, and you become aware of this kind of material. Dissociation is a lot more common than the standard discussions seem to think. Standard discussions kind of like, well, these people that dissociate, and then there's the rest of the spectrum. And this is related to what I'm talking about, because there's a dissociative thing that's going on with all these patterns, and to the extent it's compulsive, there's some dissociation going on. Because if you need to read dissociation, you need to read that as a failure of the vertical integration in the psyche.
the integration of systems in the psyche. And that is to say, dissociation simply means, from a Jungian or neo-Jungian point of view, it simply means that the complexes are more autonomous than they need to be. And there needs to be a golden thread sewing those complexes to each other so that there can be communication between them. And so you're describing a very subtle thing clinically that happens if you're looking in the eyes of someone who is dissociating in a severe way. Often you can tell that there's more than one presence in the eyes. And there are a lot of people that talk about this, but if and it's very important to be able to acknowledge all those presences. And this is like working with multiples, because even if it's a presence that should not be integrated, which I've lectured on before, what Jung called the spirit complex, you need to acknowledge in your own experience its presence. And that's all of these presences in the psyche have to be addressed one way or the other in the process of healing. And you can listen to my lectures on angels and demons and spirit possession, where I talk about that. But the important thing to know is that to the extent that the human little s self or ego is in trouble, there is dissociation present, and there's compulsivity present. And what is our job? Our job, in my view, is to be charlatans. We have to be better at doing structural analysis of what the nature of the dissociation is, what the nature of the compulsivity is, and how it is structured. What is its source? In other words, a compulsivity coming out of the royal sector is totally different than a compulsivity coming out of the magician sector. And let me just comment on that magician sector. That's the one I know the most about, because that's the one that I've struggled with the longest of my whole life. In that magician sector, that the compulsivity in the magician sector is so easy to miss. It is so easy to miss, and it's so present in the therapeutic community. That is, the compulsivity of the magician archetypal configuration. What does it do? I've lectured on this, and it's in my books, you can see it, but it's like, if you look at the diagnostic manuals, it presses compulsively towards schizoid and asocial patterns, so schizoid and avoidant patterns. And so anytime you see somebody that is escaping into their introversion, what you're seeing is a compulsive phenomenon resulting from a archetypal magician presence that is invading the ego sectors of the psyche and pushing it into isolation, and pushing it into overvaluation of mentation, cognition, pushing it into an overvaluation of intellectual pursuits at the expense of all other pursuits of the personality, and pushing it into overvaluation of so-called esoteric pursuits. And you can see this a lot in our tribe, our Jungian tribe. I mean, it is so easy to get into mental worlds and to assume that because you're into the mental worlds that somehow you're spiritually superior and esoterically enlightened, when in fact what you are colonized by the magician archetype. And we have got entire traditions of spirituality which portray themselves as being illumined, when in fact it's really possession states, and which drive people out of relatedness. It drives them out of a concern for the world. It drives them out of a concern for the body. It drives them out of a concern for the public sphere. And it's really it's easy to miss if you're into psychology, because if you're into psychology or psychotherapy, either as a profession or as an interest, you got a lot of this magician thing in your personality anyway. And if you get strokes for it, as in certain of our circles we do, although not all of them, then you get attention for manifesting these magician agendas, and it's very easy to be encouraged by the strokes you get from folks to go further into the magician rooms in the psyche and become further colonized by that archetypal structure. Now, what happens to you when you are? Well, you become less aware of how aggressive you are. You don't notice how you hurt people. You become less aware of your power agendas and the way you use your power, and you project that on other people. And you become less aware of the erotic overtones of your magician involvements. So I'll get into that more tomorrow. But anyway, the magician archetype comes in compulsively into your ego precincts, and it sets up shop, and you think you're it. And, this is the Jungian analyst that portrays themselves as the great magus, and mystifies their practice and their personality. and demands a idealizing magician transference from people. We see this in training a lot in training institutes, where if you're a candidate in the Jungian Training Institute and you do not bring an idealizing magician transference to your training analyst, then suddenly you're a borderline and they don't want you in the program. You should be. Because I'm not kidding you, it is disturbing to me how much mischief goes on in Jungian training institutes because of a lack of consciousness about the way in which this magician archetype colonizes all therapists and all psychoanalytic institutes without regard to school. And the power, the effusive sadistic power agendas of the training committees of all these, it's like graduate school, except worse. And so I just wanted to point out that what is portrayed as great illumination and erudition is a possession state. Very schizoid, very unrelated, very disembodied, sadomasochistic compulsion. And if you study at the Adler Institute or the Institute for Psychoanalysis or the Jung Institute, it doesn't matter where you study. It's present in all of these psychological training institutes and the schools of professional psychology. It's very much present there too. It's no less compulsive than a compulsive personality disorder. It's no less compulsive than a narcissistic personality disorder. It just looks more acceptable. Yes. Huge. Okay, she's saying, what is the relationship between inflation and compulsion? They go together. That's what I'm saying today and tomorrow. That any time you have got an archetypal presence that is not being related to consciously with a sense of humor and some grounding in your human life, and in your human relationships, to the extent that you kind of get isolated by that archetypal content, it is going to inflate you in Jung's classical language. You're going to be inflated. You're going to be grandiose. And to the extent that you are, it's not a moral problem. It's not your moral problem. You're a victim of a colonization, a psychological colonization by an archetypal presence. And you will be inflated, and then you will be compulsive in the way that thing structures your life. It's not you structuring your life. The archetypal configuration comes in and structures your life, and you think you're doing it. Now, this is what you've got to get your mind around. In other words, psychopathology is not near as personal as our schools of thought think it is. It is very impersonal, and it's pathology precisely because it is impersonal. It's archetypal. Archetypal doesn't mean good. It means flat. It means one-sided. It means this is what it does, and it doesn't do anything whole. The royal archetype, if it moves, it nurtures it, it blesses it, or it dominates it, depending on the form it takes. The magician archetype comes in. What does it do? It interprets it. It detaches from it. It looks at it. It is a voyeuristic position. That's what it does. It doesn't relate. It doesn't build. It doesn't love. It does what it does. The warrior configuration comes in. What does it do? It organizes. It makes it linear. It gets a project going, a mission. It's laser-like in its concentration. It doesn't relate personally. It doesn't have any personal values at all. It's work. It works. It's into work, completing the management by objective, and it doesn't care a hang about who gets in its way. It's going to roll right over them. And if it's really regressive in its form, it's violent. Verbally violent, physically violent, or intellectually violent, whatever. It's just sure. Right. I mean, you can see this in the active, in my course that I gave on the collective unconscious and psychopathology, I took Milan's categories in DSM-4 and talked about the active and passive independent, the active and passive dependent, the active and passive detached, and the active and passive ambivalent, and showed how they're related to these things. All I'm emphasizing this weekend is these things are compulsive. Let's get clear. Compulsion is not one little problem. All psychopathology is compulsion. What is the question? What sector is it in? Why is the person compulsive in this sector? It's because they're not related consciously to this sector of the archetypal ground of their self-formation. Yes, the way I think that Milan is right about the way he conceives this. Look at the latest edition of that old modern psychopathology book, and look at the way he organizes this in terms of you look at this in terms of relative integration to lower and lower levels of organization in the personality. And so from healthy integration, good enough cohesive self, then you move down to neuroses, what we used to call the neuroses and personality disorders. Then as you get into more loose organization, where you don't have a dependable structure. You see, a neurosis or a personality disorder, or even a narcissistic personality disorder, is a relatively dependable structure in the psyche. It's not balanced, but it's a relatively stable structure.
Are you feeling stuck in your life? Like you can be a better man than you are? Feeling weak, directionless, or lacking thunder? Discover your true masculine power through the king, warrior, magician, and lover archetypes, energies that have defined strong men for millennia. In just 5 minutes, this free test reveals which of your masculine energies are in balance and which need work. The result? Clear direction for your personal development and masculine empowerment. Thousands of men have gained insights to reshape their lives. Why not you? Take the Masculine Energy Indicator test now at masculinetest.com.